On a Tuesday morning in September of 1987, a man named Harlon Jessup drove 40 miles to an estate sale in Fillmore County, Minnesota, and spent $200 on a wooden cabinet that everyone else at the sale had walked past without stopping. The cabinet was roughly the size of a steamer trunk, built from white oak that had gone dark with age and machine oil, fitted with 12 shallow drawers that ran on wooden slides, each drawer labeled in a hand so precise it looked typeset. The labels said things like drill jig, 3/8 Morse taper, reamer bushing set, Acme thread, boring head fixtures, 2-inch bore. The hinges were brass. The corner joints were hand-cut dovetails. The whole thing smelled like a machine shop that had been running since before the Second World War, which, as it turned out, was exactly what it was. The estate belonged to a man named August Steinmetz, who had died in July at the age of 91 without any children and without, apparently, anyone in Fillmore County who understood what he had spent his life building. The sale was run by a woman from Rochester who specialized in farm liquidations. She had priced the cabinet at $200 because it was old and heavy and nobody had offered her anything better. She had priced the contents of the cabinet, the drawings, the tooling sheets, the fixture specifications, the hand-annotated blueprints folded into the shallow drawers alongside the physical jigs and bushings and boring heads they described, at nothing. They were included in the cabinet price. They were, in her estimation, paperwork. Harlon Jessup knew better. Let me tell you about Harlon Jessup, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did with what he found in those drawers. Harlon was 58 years old in the fall of 1987. He had grown up in Fillmore County, the son of a dairy farmer who had also run a small machine shop out of a converted granary on the back 40, sharpening equipment for neighbors and doing repair work that the county implement dealer either couldn't handle or wouldn't bother with. Harlon had learned to read a micrometer before he learned to drive. He had spent his teenage years standing at a South Bend lathe that his father had bought used from a textile mill in 1948, turning down shafts and boring out worn bearings while other boys his age were at football practice. He had gone to Votech in Rochester for 2 years after high school, then come back to the county and opened his own shop in a cinder block building at the edge of his family's property, 1,200 square feet, 3 machines, and a reputation that spread slowly and stuck permanently. By 1987, Harlon's shop had grown to 4,000 square feet and 11 machines. He did contract work for 2 implement dealers, a pump manufacturer in Rochester and a small aerospace subcontractor in Winona that made bracket assemblies for commercial aircraft. He employed 4 machinists. He had never advertised once in his life. Every job he had ever gotten had come from someone who had watched him work or had a part come back from his shop and found it better than the drawing called for. He was not a man who talked much. He was a man who looked at things carefully and thought about what he saw. He was the kind of man who, at an estate sale, would stop in front of a wooden cabinet that smelled like machine oil and read the labels on 12 drawers before he decided whether to keep moving. He read the labels. He opened the top drawer. He looked at what was inside for about 30 seconds. Then he went and found the woman from Rochester and gave her $200 in cash before anyone else could wander over and start asking questions. Let me tell you about what was in those drawers, because that's the part that the people who walked past the cabinet never understood, and it's the part that explains everything that came after. August Steinmetz had been a toolmaker, not a machinist, not a repairman, not a job shop operator, a toolmaker in the oldest and most precise sense of that word, a man who spent his working life designing and building the fixtures, jigs, gauges, and specialized cutting tools that other machinists used to make parts accurately and repeatedly. A toolmaker is to a machinist what an architect is to a carpenter. The machinist executes. The toolmaker designs the means of execution. August had worked for 30 years at a precision manufacturing company in Rochester that made hydraulic valve bodies for agricultural and industrial equipment. He had retired in 1961. In the 26 years between his retirement and his death, he had continued working in a small shop he built behind his house in Fillmore County. Not for money, but because he did not know how to stop. He had continued designing tooling. He had continued building jigs. He had continued writing up his methods in the careful, dense, annotated technical drawings that filled the shallow drawers of that white oak cabinet. What Harlon found in those drawers was not paperwork. What Harlon found was a complete engineering record of how one of the most skilled toolmakers in southern Minnesota had solved over the course of 40 years the specific problems of holding, locating, and machining hydraulic valve bodies and related components to tolerances that most job shops in the region could not reliably achieve. The drawings were not generic. They were not textbook. They were the product of a man who had spent 4 decades failing and correcting and refining, until the methods he had were the best methods he knew how to make. Written down in a hand so precise it looked typeset, because August Steinmetz had understood that a drawing was only as good as the man who could read it, and he had decided that any man who could read a drawing at all should be able to read his. There were 340 individual drawings in those 12 drawers. Harlon counted them on his workbench that same night, laid out an order under the fluorescent light of his shop, while his wife brought him coffee he forgot to drink. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. How many times have you walked past something at a sale, or a junk pile, or an auction, and thought that you understood what it was worth because you understood what it was? How many times has the price tag told you the story was over before it started? The woman from Rochester understood the cabinet. She understood it was old and heavy and smelled like a machine shop. She understood that the drawers had labels and that the labels said things she did not recognize. She priced it accordingly. Harlon Jessup understood the drawings. He understood that 340 hand-annotated tooling drawings from a master toolmaker at a precision hydraulic manufacturer represented something that could not be bought at a catalog price, could not be recreated from a textbook, and could not be replaced once it was gone. He understood that the specific problems August Steinmetz had solved, how to hold a valve body at a precise angle while boring a crossport, how to locate a reamer bushing to within 0.005 of an inch without a surface plate, how to cut an Acme thread on a hydraulic fitting without chatter, were problems that his own shop was being asked to solve with increasing frequency, as the aerospace subcontractor in Winona expanded its work and began asking for hydraulic components that the big shops in the Twin Cities were quoting at prices that made the subcontractor's purchasing manager wince. Harlon drove home with the cabinet in the bed of his truck and spent the next 3 weeks reading every drawing in it. He did not rush. He read them in order, then out of order, then in the order of the problems they addressed rather than the order August had numbered them. He took notes in a spiral notebook. He made sketches. He asked himself, for each drawing, whether he had the machines and materials to build what August had designed, and whether, if he built it, he could hold the tolerances August had specified. For 310 of the 340 drawings, the answer was yes. For the remaining 30, he would need to acquire one additional machine, a jig borer which he did not own, and develop skills in its use that he did not yet have. He priced a used jig borer from a dealer in Minneapolis. He found one, a 1959 Moore No. 3, for $11,000. He bought it. Let me tell you about the Moore No. 3 jig borer, because the machine matters here the way the drawings matter, not as an object but as a principle. A jig borer is a machine tool designed to locate and bore holes to extremely precise positions. Where a standard drill press or milling machine might locate a hole to within a few thousandths of an inch of its intended position, a jig borer, a good one, maintained correctly, operated by someone who understands its nature, can locate holes to within 0.2 of a thousandth of an inch. That is a tolerance so small that temperature changes in the shop can affect it. That is a tolerance that requires the operator to think about the expansion of metal in the morning versus the afternoon, to think about the difference between measuring a part at 68 degrees Fahrenheit and measuring it at 74. The Moore No. 3 was not a glamorous machine. It was built in 1959, the same year the first commercial jet flights crossed the Atlantic, and it looked nothing like the CNC machining centers that were beginning to appear in the larger shops in Rochester and Minneapolis by the late 1980s. It had no computer, it had no digital readout. It had a precision lead screw and a set of gauge blocks and a man who knew how to use them. It was, in the estimation of most shop owners Harlan's age, obsolete. Harlon Jessup did not agree. Let me tell you why, because this is the part that the people who laughed at him later never took the time to understand. A CNC machining center in 1987 was a powerful and expensive and capable machine. It could move fast. It could repeat a programmed sequence of operations with extraordinary consistency. It could do in 3 hours what a skilled machinist with a manual mill might take 2 days to accomplish. What it could not do, reliably, in 1987, with the software and control systems available at that time, was locate a hole to within 0.2 of a thousandth of an inch in a part that had already been partially machined and might have accumulated small errors in its previous operations. What it could not do was think about what had already happened to the part and adjust for it. What it could not do was what August Steinmetz's drawings required. The Moore No. 3 could do all of that, if the man running it understood both the machine and the drawings. Harlon spent 8 months learning the jig borer before he quoted his first job using it. He ran test pieces. He scrapped test pieces. He ran them again. He built 3 of August's jigs from the drawings, checked them against the drawing's specified tolerances, found 2 that needed adjustment, adjusted them, and checked them again. He was not in a hurry. He was building something. The aerospace subcontractor in Winona was named Lundgren Precision Components, and the man who ran it was a purchasing manager named Scott Prescott. Scott Prescott was 41 years old, had a degree in business administration from the University of Minnesota, drove a new Buick, and had been managing purchasing for Lundgren for 6 years. He was good at his job. He understood cost, lead time, and supplier reliability. He understood the difference between a shop that could hold plus or minus 5 thousandths and a shop that claimed to hold plus or minus 1 thousandth, and then shipped parts that were plus or minus 3. He had been burned enough times by shops that oversold their capabilities that he had developed a finely calibrated skepticism about any job shop owner who walked into his office and told him what they could do. In the spring of 1989, Lundgren received a contract modification from one of its aircraft customers that required a new family of hydraulic manifold blocks. Aluminum bodies with multiple intersecting bored passages, each passage located to a position tolerance of plus or minus 1/10 of a thousandth of an inch. Each passage required to intersect its neighbors within half a thousandth of true center. The big shops in the Twin Cities had quoted the job. The quotes had come back at prices that made the purchasing manager's eyebrows go up, and the delivery times that made his program manager's jaw go down. He needed another option. Harlon Jessup drove to Winona on a Wednesday in April of 1989 and sat across a conference table from Scott Prescott and told him that he could make the manifold blocks. He brought 3 sample parts he had made to the drawing tolerances, measured on his own equipment. He brought a copy of his quality system documentation. He brought, though he did not show it unless asked, a summary of the relevant tooling drawings from August Steinmetz's cabinet, annotated in his own hand to show which of August's methods he intended to apply to Lundgren's specific geometry. Scott Prescott looked at the sample parts. He looked at the quality documentation. He looked at Harlon Jessup, who was wearing a clean flannel shirt and had grease under 2 of his fingernails that he had not entirely managed to remove, and he said, "You're a 4,000 square foot job shop in Fillmore County. These parts require tolerances that shops 3 times your size have told me they can't hold reliably." Harlon said, "I know." Scott said, "Why should I believe you can do what they can't?" Harlon said, "Because I have better tooling." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Scott Prescott said, "I'd like to see your shop." He drove down to Fillmore County the following week and spent 3 hours in Harlon's shop. He watched Harlon run a test piece on the Moore No. 3. He watched Harlon use the jigs from August's drawings to locate the part. He watched Harlon measure the finished holes with a set of gauge blocks and a dial indicator and write the measurements down in a log. He did not say much during this process. He was a man who had learned to watch carefully before he spoke, which was, in its way, the same skill that Harlon had, applied to a different domain. At the end of the 3 hours, Scott Prescott said, "Where did you get that tooling?" Harlon told him about the estate sale, about August Steinmetz, about the $200 and the 12 drawers and the 340 drawings and the 3 weeks of reading and the 8 months of learning the jig borer before he quoted anything. Scott Prescott was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, I'll give you a first article run of 20 pieces. If you hold tolerance on all 20, we'll talk about a production order." Harlon held tolerance on all 20 pieces. The first article inspection report, conducted by Lundgren's quality department in Winona, showed that every critical dimension was within specification, and that 11 of the 20 pieces were closer to nominal than the drawing required. The quality engineer who wrote the report put a note in the margin that said, "Supplier appears to have exceptional fixturing capability. Recommend production approval." Lundgren placed the production order. It was for 400 pieces at a price that represented, at Harlon's shop rate, approximately 9 months of his previous annual revenue. Now, let me tell you about what happened at the implement dealer's counter in Preston, because that's where the story gets complicated. The implement dealer in Preston was a man named Dale Crowley, and Dale Crowley was the kind of man who had an opinion about everything in the volume to ensure that his opinions were heard by everyone within 30 feet of wherever he happened to be standing. He had been selling and servicing farm equipment in Fillmore County for 22 years. He knew everyone. He knew their equipment, their credit history, their family situations, and their tendencies. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had built his authority on knowing what things were worth and what they could do, and he had a particular and well-developed contempt for what he called old iron, meaning any piece of equipment built before, roughly, 1975. Dale Crowley had been in Harlan's shop twice for repair work on equipment that his own service department had been unable to fix. He had a general respect for Harlon as a machinist, and a general skepticism about what he called Harlan's tendency to live in the past, by which he meant Harlan's preference for manual machines and his stated belief that the new CNC equipment was solving problems that didn't need solving while creating problems that nobody was talking about yet. In the fall of 1989, word had gotten around Preston, as word gets around in small counties, that Harlon Jessup had landed a significant aerospace contract. This was the kind of news that traveled through the co-op and the implement dealer and the coffee shop at the same speed and with the same level of embellishment as any other county news. By the time it reached Dale Crowley's counter, it had been through enough hands that some of the details had shifted, but the core of it was accurate. Harlon had gotten a big contract, and he had gotten it because of some old drawings he had bought at a dead man's estate sale. Dale Crowley thought this was funny. $200, he said to the three men standing at his counter on a Thursday morning in October. He paid $200 for a box of old paperwork, and now he thinks he's bowing. He laughed, and the laugh was the particular kind of laugh that men use when they want to establish that they are not impressed, which is usually a sign that they are more impressed than they want to admit. Old drawings, old machine, old Harlon. That's what you get when you won't move with the times. One of the men at the counter, a farmer named Wendell Backer, who had known Harlon for 30 years, said, "He got the contract, though." Dale Crowley waved a hand. "First article run. They'll find a real supplier by spring. A shop with actual CNC capability. You can't build a production business on a 50-year-old jig borer and a dead man's blueprints." Let me tell you about that laugh, because it's worth understanding what it was and what it wasn't. Dale Crowley was not a stupid man. He was a man who had built his expertise on a very specific kind of knowledge. The knowledge of what modern equipment could do and what it cost and how to sell it. And that expertise had served him well for 22 years. When he laughed at Harlon Jessup, he was not laughing at Harlon. He was laughing at the idea that old methods and old machines could compete with new ones, because in his experience, in the domain he knew, they couldn't. He had watched farmers hold on to old equipment out of stubbornness and pay for it in downtime and repair costs. He had watched the county's implement needs change and the shops that couldn't change with them close. His laugh was the laugh of a man who had been right about this pattern enough times that he had stopped questioning it. What Dale Crowley did not know, and could not know from where he stood, was that the precision machining industry in 1989 was not the farm equipment industry. It was not a domain where newer was reliably better and older was reliably worse. It was a domain where the specific capabilities of a specific machine, operated by a specific person with specific knowledge, determined what was possible, and where the CNC revolution, for all its genuine advantages in speed and repeatability, had created a generation of shops that were very good at making parts fast and somewhat less good at making parts that were very, very accurate. The tolerance that Lundgren's manifold blocks required was not a tolerance that speed helped you hold. It was a tolerance that knowledge helped you hold, and the knowledge was in the drawers. Wendell Backer went back to his farm and said nothing more about it. Dale Crowley went back to his counter. Harlon Jessup went back to his shop and ran parts. Let me tell you about the next 4 years, because they are the reason this story is worth telling. Between 1989 and 1993, Harlon Jessup's shop grew from 4,000 square feet to 8,000. He hired 3 additional machinists, bringing his total to 7. He acquired 2 more manual machines, a second South Bend lathe and a horizontal boring mill, and 1 CNC turning center, which he used for roughing operations on parts that he would finish on the manual equipment. He did not acquire a CNC machining center because he had looked at what the CNC machining centers available in his price range could reliably do and concluded that they could not hold the tolerances he was working to on the critical features of his parts. He was not opposed to CNC. He was opposed to using a tool that was wrong for the job because it was fashionable. The Lundgren contract expanded 3 times. The manifold blocks were followed by valve body housings, then by a family of hydraulic actuator bodies for a regional agricultural equipment manufacturer that Lundgren had referred to Harlon directly. By 1991, Harlon was running 2 shifts and had a backlog of 6 weeks. The drawings in the 12 drawers were not the only thing driving this. Harlon was a good machinist and a careful businessman, and he would have built a solid shop with or without August Steinmetz's cabinet. But the drawings gave him something that no amount of individual skill and careful management could have given him on the same timeline. They gave him 40 years of solved problems. They gave him the methods that August Steinmetz had developed by failing and correcting and refining, available to Harlon without the failing and the correcting, compressed into 340 sheets of paper in 12 shallow drawers. They gave him a 10-year head start on every other job shop in the region that was trying to develop the same capabilities from scratch. In 1991, a precision shop in Rochester that had been quoting against Harlon on Lundgren work, a shop with 12 CNC machining centers and 40 employees, and a building 3 times the size of Harlon's, lost a production contract to Harlon's shop on a part that the Rochester shop's quality manager had told the customer they could hold, and then demonstrated, over 2 first article runs, that they could not. The Rochester shop's owner, a man named Brad Thornton, called Harlon's shop and asked to speak to him. He asked, without much preamble, how Harlon was holding the position tolerance on the crossbore intersections. Harlon said, "Tooling." Brad Thornton said, "What kind of tooling?" Harlon said, "The kind that works." Brad Thornton was quiet for a moment. He said, "I've got 12 CNC machining centers. I've got a full-time programmer. I've got a CMM room. I can't hold that tolerance on that part. How is a shop your size holding it on a machine that was built before I was born?" Harlon said, "Because the machine doesn't decide the tolerance. The method decides the tolerance. The machine just has to be capable enough to execute the method." Brad Thornton did not have an immediate answer for this. He thanked Harlon and hung up. Let me tell you about what Scott Prescott said when he visited the shop in the spring of 1992, because it matters for what happened next. Scott Prescott had been driving down to Fillmore County 2 or 3 times a year since 1989, partly for quality audits and partly, Harlon suspected, because he found the shop interesting in a way that he didn't entirely know how to explain to his colleagues. He was a purchasing manager who had spent his career navigating the gap between what suppliers said they could do and what they actually could do. And Harlon's shop was one of the very few he had ever worked with where the gap ran in the opposite direction, where the shop consistently delivered better than it had promised and never seemed to feel the need to explain why. On the spring visit in 1992, Scott walked through the shop and stopped in front of the white oak cabinet, which Harlon had moved from his house to the shop floor and placed against the wall between the Moore jig borer and the horizontal boring mill. The cabinet had been cleaned and oiled. The brass hinges had been polished. The labels on the 12 drawers were still in August Steinmetz's hand. Scott said, "Is that the cabinet?" Harlon said, "That's it." Scott opened the top drawer and looked at the drawings inside without touching them. He said, "Have you ever thought about what would have happened if someone else had bought this?" Harlon said, "Every day." Scott closed the drawer. He said, $200. Harlon said, $200. They stood there for a moment in the sound of the shop, the steady turning of the lathe, the occasional ring of metal on metal, the hiss of cutting fluid, and then Scott said, "You know what this is worth now?" Harlon said, "I know what it was worth then. That's the same number." Scott looked at him. Harlon said, "It was worth exactly what I was capable of doing with it, not $1 more. If I hadn't known what I was looking at, it would have been worth $200 in a nice cabinet." Let me tell you about the conversation Harlon had with August Steinmetz's nephew in 1993, because that's the part of the story that very few people know. August Steinmetz had died without children, but he had a nephew in Rochester, a retired postal worker named Emmett Steinmetz, who had handled the estate and authorized the sale, and had not known, at the time, that the white oak cabinet contained anything other than old shop paperwork. Emmett was 74 years old in 1993 and had read a small article in a Rochester business journal about Harlon's shop and its aerospace work. He had driven down to Fillmore County on a Saturday morning and knocked on the door of the cinder block building and introduced himself. Harlon brought him inside and showed him the cabinet. Emmett stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. He opened several drawers and looked at the drawings in August's precise hand. He said, "He was always drawing, every night after supper. I thought it was just something he did to keep himself busy." Harlon said, "It was the most important work he ever did." Emmett said, "He never told anyone." Harlon said, "Some men don't need to tell anyone. They just need someone to find it." Emmett asked Harlon if he felt he had gotten the better of the deal. Harlon thought about this for a moment and then said, "I think your uncle got exactly what he wanted out of it. He spent 40 years building something that would outlast him." "It has." Emmett looked at the cabinet for another long moment. He said, "He would have liked you." Harlon said, "I hope so. I've been talking to him for 4 years." Emmett laughed, and it was a different kind of laugh than the one Dale Crowley had produced at the implement dealer's counter. It was the laugh of a man who had just understood something that had been sitting in front of him for years without revealing itself. Emmett did not ask for money. He did not ask for the cabinet back. He drove home to Rochester and sent Harlon a letter 2 weeks later that said, among other things, that August had kept a journal, and that the journal mentioned, in an entry from 1963, that he hoped his drawings would someday end up with someone who knew what to do with them. Emmett enclosed the journal entry. Harlon framed it and hung it above the white oak cabinet where it remained for the rest of his working life. Now, let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because the story requires it. In the fall of 1993, the implement dealership in Preston was under financial pressure. The farm equipment market in Fillmore County had been difficult for several years, and Dale Crowley had made 2 decisions in 1991 that had not worked out the way he had planned. He had taken on a line of equipment that proved unreliable and generated warranty claims that his service department could not keep up with, and he had expanded his building at a moment when his cash flow did not support the expansion. He was not in crisis. He was in the kind of slow, grinding difficulty that is in some ways harder than crisis because it does not announce itself clearly enough to force a decision. In October of 1993, one of the pieces of equipment Dale had sold, a hydraulic-driven baler attachment that had been given problems since delivery, developed a failure in its valve body that Dale's service department could not repair. The manufacturer's parts were back-ordered for 12 weeks. The customer, a farmer named Lyle Vandermeer who ran 800 acres south of Preston, was facing the end of his hay season with a baler that didn't work and a dealer who was telling him 12 weeks. Dale Crowley drove out to Lyle Vandermeer's farm and looked at the valve body and knew, within about 30 seconds, that he was looking at a machining problem. A worn bore and a damaged seating surface that needed to be recut to a precise dimension and finished to restore the hydraulic seal. It was not a complicated problem. It was a precision problem. And Dale Crowley knew, standing in Lyle Vandermeer's equipment shed in October of 1993, exactly one shop in the county that could do precision work on hydraulic components. He drove to Harlon Jessup's shop. Harlon was at the Moore jig borer when Dale came in. He finished the operation he was running, wrote the measurement in his log, and then turned around and looked at Dale Crowley, who was standing in the middle of the shop floor holding a hydraulic valve body and wearing an expression that was doing its best to look like something other than what it was. Dale said, "I've got a customer in trouble, valve body, worn bore, and a damaged seat. I need it remachined to spec." Harlon looked at the valve body. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at the bore and the seat. He said, "Acme thread on the seat fitting?" Dale said, "Yes." Harlon said, "Leave it." Dale set the valve body on Harlon's workbench. He stood there for a moment and then said, "I can have it back in a week?" Harlon said, 3 days. Dale nodded. He started toward the door and then stopped. He turned around and said, "I said some things at my counter a few years back about the old drawings and the old machine." He paused. "I was wrong about that." Harlon looked at him for a moment. He said, "You weren't wrong about everything. A lot of old iron is just old iron. You have to know the difference." Dale said, "How do you know the difference?" Harlon said, "You read the drawings." Dale Crowley nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has just received an answer that he understands but cannot immediately use. He said, "The drawings in the cabinet." Harlon said, "August Steinmetz spent 40 years solving the exact problem you just walked in here with. He solved it before either of us was thinking about it. The only question was whether anybody was going to find the solution before it ended up in a landfill." Dale said, $200. Harlon said, $200. Dale Crowley left. Harlon turned back to the Moore jig borer, pulled August Steinmetz's drawing for the Acme thread reaming fixture from the second drawer of the white oak cabinet, and went to work. Let me tell you about the 3 days that followed, because they are the mechanical heart of this story. The valve body Dale Crowley had brought in was a cast-iron housing, roughly the size of a large grapefruit, with 5 intersecting board passages and a threaded seat fitting that had been damaged by a previous repair attempt. Someone had tried to chase the thread with a tap and had gone in slightly off angle, leaving a thread that was partly correct and partly not, which was worse than a thread that was entirely wrong because it would seal under low pressure and fail under high. The primary bore had been worn by contamination in the hydraulic fluid to a diameter that was 6/1000 of an inch over its nominal dimension, which sounds small until you understand that 6/1000 of a thousandth of an inch is the difference between a hydraulic seal and a hydraulic leak. August Steinmetz's drawings included a fixture for holding valve bodies of this general family. Not this exact valve body, which had been designed 20 years after August retired, but the same geometric family, the same relationship between bore center lines, the same Acme thread specification on the seat fitting. The fixture located the part from its mounting face and 2 precision-reamed holes that were present on every valve body in this family as a legacy of the original design standard. Once the part was located in the fixture, the Moore jig borer could find the center line of the worn bore to within 2/10 of a thousandth of an inch and rebore it to an oversized dimension for which August had also, in his thorough and unhurried way, specified a sleeve repair method. A thin-walled steel sleeve pressed into the rebored housing, finish bored to the original nominal dimension, that would restore the bore to its original specification without any external indication that a repair had been made. Harlon ran the rebore on the first day. He made the sleeve on the second day, pressed it in, and finish bored it to nominal. On the third day, he recut the seat-fitting thread using August's Acme thread fixture, which guided the tap in at the correct angle regardless of the damage left by the previous attempt, and then measured the finished part against the original drawing dimensions. Every dimension was within specification. The sleeve bore was nominal to within 1/10 of a thousandth. The seat thread was correct on the first pass. Harlon called Dale Crowley on the afternoon of the third day and told him the part was ready. Dale came and picked it up. He took it to Lyle Vandermeer's farm and installed it. The baler ran. Lyle Vandermeer finished his hay season. Dale Crowley paid Harlon's invoice without comment, which was, from Dale Crowley, a form of eloquence. Let me tell you about what happened to the white oak cabinet over the years that followed, because the cabinet is not just a cabinet, and the story does not end with Lyle Vandermeer's baler. By 1997, Harlon had built 2 additional jigs from August's drawings that he had not initially had the machines or materials to build. One for a family of pump housings that a new customer in La Crosse had brought to him, one for a specialized boring operation on actuator bodies that required a fixture geometry that Harlon had spent 2 months trying to design from scratch before he found, in the 9th drawer of the cabinet, a drawing that August had made in 1958 for a nearly identical problem. The drawing was not identical to what Harlon needed. It was close enough that Harlon could see the principle and adapt it, which was, he later said, more valuable than an identical drawing would have been, because adapting it required him to understand why August had made the choices he had made, and understanding why was worth more than copying what. In 1999, Harlon gave a presentation at a precision machining conference in Minneapolis. The conference was attended by shop owners and engineers from across the upper Midwest, most of them running CNC equipment, and most of them dealing with the specific quality problems that came with holding very tight tolerances on CNC machines that had been designed for speed rather than precision. Harlon talked about August Steinmetz and the white oak cabinet and the 340 drawings and the Moore No. 3 jig borer. He talked about the difference between a machine that was capable and a method that was correct, and about how the method had to exist before the machine could execute it, and about how the most sophisticated CNC machine in the world could not compensate for a method that was wrong. He brought 3 of August's drawings to show, He put them up on the projector screen. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when people are looking at something that is better than they expected. After the presentation, a man from a shop in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, came up to Harlon and said, "Where did you find a toolmaker who could produce drawings like that?" Harlon said, "At an estate sale in Fillmore County. He'd been dead for 12 years. The man from Eau Claire looked at the drawings for a long moment. He said, "What did you pay for them?" Harlon said, $200 for the cabinet. The drawings came with it. The man said, $200. Harlon said, "And knowing what I was looking at, that part wasn't for sale." Let me tell you about the morning in 2003 when Harlon Jessup retired, because the retirement matters for what happened after. Harlon was 74 years old in 2003 and had been running his shop for 40 years. His 4 original machinists had all retired or moved on. Of his current 7 employees, 3 had been with him for more than 15 years. The shop had grown once more to 11,000 square feet, and now ran a mix of manual and CNC equipment. The CNC Turning Center had been joined by 2 CNC machining centers, which Harlon had acquired in the late 1990s, when the control systems had improved to the point where they could be used for the roughing and semi-finishing operations that preceded the final precision work on the Moore jig borer. The Moore was still running. It had been rebuilt once in 1995 by a machine tool rebuilder in Chicago who had told Harlon it was one of the finest examples of that model he had ever seen, and who had asked twice whether Harlon wanted to sell it. Harlon did not want to sell it. The white oak cabinet was still on the shop floor, between the Moore and the horizontal boring mill. The brass hinges were still polished. The labels were still in August Steinmetz's hand, though they had faded somewhat, and Harlon had, at some point, gone over each one lightly with a fine pen to preserve the lettering. On the morning of his retirement, Harlon gathered his 7 employees in the shop and told them that the cabinet and the drawings were the most important thing in the building. Not the Moore, not the CNC machining centers, not the quality system documentation or the customer relationships or the backlog. The drawings. He told them that the drawings represented a man's life work, and that a man's life work deserved to be used and maintained and passed on, not filed away and forgotten. He told them that every time they pulled a drawing from one of those drawers to solve a problem, they were having a conversation with August Steinmetz, and they should conduct themselves in that conversation accordingly. He told them that the $200 he had paid for the cabinet in 1987 was the best investment he had ever made, and that the return on that investment had nothing to do with money. The return was the ability to solve problems that other people couldn't solve, and to solve them in a way that August Steinmetz would have recognized and approved of, and to pass that ability on to the next person who needed it. Then he went home and let his shop run without him, which it did because he had built it to. Let me tell you about what happened in 2011, because that's the generational turn, and the generational turn is where this kind of story either dies or becomes something larger than itself. Harlon's shop had been run since 2003 by a machinist named Virgil Ostrander, who had joined the shop in 1991 at the age of 24, and had spent 12 years learning every machine in the building before Harlon trusted him with the keys. Virgil was not Harlon. He was a different kind of man. More talkative, more willing to explain himself, more comfortable with the CNC equipment that now made up the majority of the shop's production capacity. But he had learned the Moore jig borer from Harlon, and he had learned to read August Steinmetz's drawings from Harlon, and he had